Hey everybody, it's Professor Parish, and I am recording this video a little earlier than usual, but we have a lot to talk about this week, and so I want to get right to it. So, first thing is first, we have made it into poetry! First week in! So far I've looked at some of your thesis statements for paper number 2, and I've been really impressed with them. I really think that the topics you all have picked so far will work great. Please remember to submit that by Sunday. If you're not sure, paper 2 is probably the weirdest paper that we do in this class because it's a little bit different formatting wise than what we're used to. If you're not sure on what topic you want to do, I would encourage you to go ahead and list different ideas, and then I can talk with you about which one I think will work better. So this is week 7. So we are a few weeks shy of spring break. We're delving into poetry. Your paper number 1 is graded. So you can now go to your online page. You can go to the grade book, see your grade in the class, and you can view your paper. I will be honest, guys and gals, this class had possibly the best set of papers, paper number 1, possibly the best set of number 1 papers that I've read in quite a while. So pat yourselves on the back. Everyone that turned in a paper did awesome. I think that the most I critiqued on papers were just grammar, things like grammar and mechanics. The elements of fiction used throughout were great. You all have such a vivid creativity and imagination with your papers. The formatting was great. It was fluid. Everyone's papers flowed. They weren't just chunky and just splotched together on a page. They had a thread. They connected. The introduction and conclusions were good. I think there was only one paper where I said, you need to put a conclusion in there, but that was it. Minor, for paper number 1, minor things to note and take with you into the next paper that we do. So kudos to you all for crafting a really good first paper in this class. I was really impressed with the class as a whole, and I'm hoping that that momentum carries into our next couple of papers, because I think that if you all have set the bar good, now we can just keep raising it up, right? It's like the opposite of limbo. So, speaking of paper number 1, before we delve into our chapters today for poetry, I do want to talk about revision. So, when I was in college, my English teachers basically gave you a prompt, gave you a paper theme or a topic, or they let you pick your topic like I do. And then once you turned your paper in, that was pretty much it. Your paper was in, and you got a grade, and that's where that paper kind of just settled down. I'm not a big fan of that, because we are in an English course. We are supposed to become better writers, to become more critical thinkers and revisionists, and one of the course objectives in this class is talking about revising and editing materials. And I think it's not fair to students to expect them to turn in a piece of work and they never see that work again. So I am an advocate of revision. I think that it's only helpful that you revise, you make your papers better, and in turn you learn from your mistakes so that you make less of them in future papers. So, long story short, you do get a chance to revise papers 1, 2, and 3. You cannot revise the final paper because it's due when the class ends. However, when we get to that final paper, there is something in place to give you a revision process, so don't worry about that. When we get to paper 4, we will talk about it, all right? But at least paper 1, 2, and 3, once it's graded, you will have a window to revise it. So if I go, I'm going to change to student view. If I go to the course content page, we're still on week 6 as I'm recording this. I'm recording this on the Saturday of week 6. So we still have your thesis and the discussion forum. Week 7, you will have your outline, which we'll talk about shortly, and the discussion forum. Week 8, you will notice we do not have a discussion forum in week 8, so look forward to that. We won't talk to each other for a week. I'm kidding. But you'll notice that it is optional to revise. Now, I want to clarify that I sent out, when I graded your paper number 1, I may have commented on your paper that revisions were due February 25th. That was my mistake, and I am sorry. we are going to go with what is posted in the class, and that is going to be March 3rd is the due date for revisions. You're welcome to turn them in early if you want. If you want to submit it by February 25th, go for it, because at this point we'll be working on paper 2. So you can turn in your revisions as early as you want. That's fine. But March 3rd at 11:55 p.m. will be the last time I will take revisions for paper 1. Okay? In order to revise a paper, you do have to submit the original draft on time, but if you submit the original draft on time, you do get a chance to revise. So, just make note of that. If you got an A on paper 1, you probably don't have to revise. I've had several students that were perfectionists. They're like, no, I want a 100% on every paper. And I was like, okay, it's your class. You do what you want. But in all honesty, if you've got an A, you're probably all right. If you got a B or below, I would encourage you to revise, because it's probably grammar, and you can revise grammar. How, you may ask? I am about to show you. So, as I've said before, grammar was probably the biggest critique I had. So, I have pulled up a student's paper. I'm not going to say who, but they did a really good job on this paper. They just had a few small grammar errors. Otherwise, they did a great job. So, when you pull your paper up, when you download it, and in order to revise, you need to use Microsoft Word. So please make note of that. If you try to open it in Notepad or some kind of open source thing, it may not show you these red lines. If you don't see these red lines, then you need to open it in Microsoft Word. So just please keep that in mind. So when you open up the document, you will see these little red lines out to the side of your paper. That means that I have made an edit to something in your paper, something that needs to be corrected. So if I click on these red lines, notice they turn gray, and in that line, this gray line represents that there's an error somewhere in this sentence. That's what that gray line represents. And you can see it's right here. We already had a question mark here, so we did not need the period after it. We didn't need 2 sets of punctuation. So the easiest way to revise these papers is that when you see an error in red, like this, then what you'll do is you will basically put your mouse right over the top of it and right-click using your mouse, and you will see, and my computer doesn't show up exactly like it should because I'm still working on my home laptop to get this all set up. I know, I'm awful. But you'll see this thing that says accept deletion. If you accept deletion, it will make that change and it will take it out of your paper. Okay? If you reject deletion, it will put that period right back in the paper, which we don't want to do. So what you need to do is go through each time that you see this error. Like right here, there's a comma added. So I'll do that. And now since I added the comma, it will say accept insertion, meaning I put it into the paper instead of taking it out. I'll just click that, and it will make the comma part of the paper. Your goal in revising is to make these lines out to the side disappear. When you correct an error, this line will disappear. You don't want your paper to have any of these lines when you turn it back into me for a better grade. Okay? And like we go down here, there's another comma added. If I scroll down here, there's some commas added throughout. Just little nitpicky grammar things, nothing major. And then some commas, commas, commas. I told y'all I'm comma happy, and I definitely was with this paper. Comma, comma, and then the grade. So, if I had made a comment in this paper, it's probably out to the side here, you would be able to right-click, and there would be an option that says to delete comment, and then you just delete it. So that is how you take care of revisions. You'll just make sure to click, because if I click these red lines again, then the errors disappear. But as soon as I add them, it shows what they are. So make sure these lines are gone before you resubmit, because once they're gone, that means that that part has been revised. Okay? That is your goal. Take your paper, look for these lines. When you see a line like this, go through it, find the error, get rid of it, and that line will disappear. Alright? And that's how you revise a paper. So it's pretty easy, pretty straightforward. If you have questions, please feel free to email me and ask about it. But otherwise, you have until March 3rd to revise paper 1. All right. So what is due week 7? Week 7, you have a discussion forum and your outline. So this week 6, this last week, week 6, which I'm videotaping right now, you had your thesis, and then your outline is going to be just like what we did with paper 1. You'll have your introduction paragraph of your analysis, your body structure, like what points are you going to talk about, where are you going to put your poem in at, or your poems if you did option 2, and then your conclusion. So it's going to look very much like the outline for paper number 1. All right. If you didn't do the outline for paper 1, then I suggest going back to the week that we start talking about the outline, which was week 3, and watch the week 3 video where I talk about how to do the outline if you didn't do it for paper 1. All right, and that's pretty much it. Homework-wise, it's a pretty low-key week. You're just working on paper 2, your outline, and the discussion forum. I'm very excited about the discussion forums that we're going to do because it's going to give you lots of choices. This poetry unit is all about choices, finding poems that you like and that you want to talk about. So I'm excited about that. But that is revising papers and going through all of that. All right. If we go to our resources and we scroll down to week 7, we have 2 links here. We have a link back to the presentation that we watched last week, only we're going to finish it. And then we have an example paper. Now, if you chose option 1 or option 3, then this example paper is kind of the format that you could do. So, this person took my class semesters ago. They talked about T.S. Eliot's Old Possum's Book to Practical Cats, about poetry, in which the musical Cats was based on, which I didn't know until I read this paper. And he chose The Song of the Jellicles and The Rum Tum Tugger as his 2 poems. And he kind of leads off with talking about his own poem and how it's going to use different formats that are similar to these 2 poems in question. So his analysis goes through describing the 2 poems, talking about how T.S. Eliot wrote both, describing, and then showing what they have in common. So he describes each poem first, then he describes what their similarities are and what their differences are. And so that's one kind of structure you can do with this paper. It really is, if you chose option 1 and 2, 1 or 3, it is really a compare or contrast paper. And then in conclusion, I will say that this student could have beefed up their conclusion a little bit. It's a little abrupt. It's a little too brief. But I really like the analysis that they do. I like that part. I think the conclusion could have had a little bit more content and maybe a little bit more lead up into this poem that they create. And that poem I would consider half a page. I know it's not half a page of text, but it's half a page long, and that's what I'm looking for. So, formatting wise, that's great. And then you'll notice at the very end, they cited the Old Possum's Books of Practical Cats in MLA format like they should. So they didn't cite the textbook, which I got onto them for. They should have had our Discovering Literature book cited right there, but they did cite where they got the poems out of. So that was a plus. All right. So this example paper is in your resources. If you chose example number 2, then I am working on getting you all an example to look at as well. But if you chose option 1 or 3, this is a nice paper to reference for your own purposes. All right. So let's dive back into poetry here. You'll notice, if you looked at the slide from week 6, that we really only have 3 slides left in this slide. And that's because you may have saw in when you read that we're going over chapters 13, 14, and 15, you may have been like, 3 chapters in a week? That's so much. There is not a lot of terminology in these 3 chapters. There really isn't, for better or for worse. So, going with chapter 13, it's all about pattern. We talked a little bit about pattern last week and setting up that whole A, B, C. My dog is in the floor here, wanting me to rub his belly. We talked about the patterns that poems have and that they use. And so this chapter kind of expands upon that. So, come here, bud. Come here. Come here. So, one of the terms that they give us is the term of context. And context in the book is described as a web of meanings, which I really like that terminology, because that's essentially what it is. It's several different threads of meaning that are all kind of connected. They expand, they overlap. It's very much like a spider's web in tracing the different contexts and meanings that a poem can have. Because you have to take into account two different things. One, what the author is intending, what their whole point and style and purpose is, and two, how we interact with it. Because we may interact with a poem and get something totally different out of it than the author intended. And that's kind of okay with poetry. With fiction, if we don't get the right theme, it affects the entire story, and it makes it hard to really be able to enjoy. But with a poem, it's not like there's a consistent theme or thread throughout. It's very subjective. So that is kind of a benefit of poetry over fiction, is that you're not reliant on your audience getting what you mean. They may not get it and still find value in it. So this chapter tells us that our poems often question and work out answers. So a poem may offer a question and then give an answer. They can play off of what's called opposites or polarities. They help us to draw mental maps and make comparisons. So a lot of times poems will compare one thing to another in order to make a statement or draw reference to something. On page 651, they talk to us about how poems often pit man versus woman, or day versus night, or land versus sea. They're drawing those comparisons and contrasting elements to kind of show us the importance of both, or that one's better than the other. It serves a purpose. They play off of contrasting points of view. So a poem may give us a moment from one person's perspective and then shift by the end of the poem to another person's perspective. That's an option. And then finally, they can also have kind of prose elements. Like when we looked over fiction several weeks ago, do you remember the graphic that was the roller coaster that went up? It was like building tension and then climax and then resolution, right? Well, a poem can do that as well. It can build to a certain point and then end and kind of have a resolution as well. So these are just elements with the pattern that poems can have, and you'll notice that we're starting to get back into terminology we talked about in fiction. So we have the term of climax, we have the term of closure. Some poems don't have closure, but I would argue most have some kind of ending. It may be bleak, it may be depressing or scary or hopeful, but it usually will tend to have an ending or a resolution, some kind of closure in the poem. And we have our example on page 653 of Wendell Berry's The Peace of Wild Things. And you can tell in that last line of this very short poem, there's that sense of closure. I rest in the grace of the world and am free. It's like, oh, it's just a nice, like, what a nice ending to that poem, right? So, I mean, ideally, most poems will have a sense of closure. And then on page 654, this slide doesn't talk about it, but there is also the idea of focus, in that the poet creates a poem to make a reader closely look at something. So we talked last week about how poems can focus on a single moment, or a single time period, or a single aspect of something. And this is talking about that. It's saying, yes, a poet can focus on one tiny, minute thing, and the whole point is to get you to notice it. It's not asking you to react. It's not asking you to be an activist or anything. It's just saying, hey, notice this one thing and think about it. That's kind of the whole point of that poem there, or that aspect of poetry. All right. Our pattern chapter does have more terminology as you go on to page 657. There's the idea of concrete poetry. Again, we talked about abstract versus concrete in our fiction unit. And concrete is poetry about very physical, tangible things. So think Robert Frost. He wrote lots of nature poetry. He wrote about physical, tangible objects around him, in addition to writing about some metaphorical things as well. Things that poets can use. That's what the rest of this slide is. These are all kind of stylistic pattern elements that you can put into your own poem. So repetition. Repetition is a prominent feature in Dr. Seuss's work. So when I was a kid, One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish was like my favorite story ever. I made my parents read that book over and over again. I think my dad was like about to have a high speed come apart. But it was all repetition. It was, as a little kid, your mind is kind of stimulated by that. So it'd be like one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. Small feet, big feet. Here come pig's feet. That was like my favorite line in the whole book. I like laughed every time he said that. But it's just that repetition, and your mind picks up on that and thinks that it's really clever, and it's like, oh, look at that. But yeah, you can use repetition in your paper through poetry. Parallelism, we talked about that term as well in fiction. It's where the poem starts and ends in a certain way with a similar style or similar text. Shel Silverstein, who's one of my favorite kids authors. I say kids author, I mean his stuff's for anybody. But a lot of his poems in Where the Sidewalk Ends and Falling Up have a very nice use of parallelism, where he starts it out one way and he ends it the same way, but by the time you reach the end of the poem, the context has completely changed. Like, at first you think a character is one thing, and then by the end of the poem you're like, oh no, they're not what I thought at all. But it still ends and begins the same way. So, if you've not read Shel Silverstein, go out and read his stuff, because it's excellent, and you'll see what I'm talking about when you read his poems. I might try to find some to put on here next couple of days. That might be good. Cumulative is when a poem, like we talked about in the last slide, builds to a certain point, so it keeps building to a climax and then has a resolution, whereas counterpoint is bouncing from idea to idea to idea. It's not building necessarily, it's just bouncing. So it's like a pinball. Some poems, you'll notice, are formatted to where they look like they are counterpoint. So you may see a verse start here, the next verse is over here, then the next verse is over here, then the next verse is over here. And I would encourage you, if you're doing option 2, you all can really play around with how your poem looks. I really liked Pirates of the Caribbean when it first came out. So when I was in college, I did a lot of poetry in my creative writing classes about like the ocean and about pirates, because I thought it was cool. And one of my poems, I started out at the top of my paper, and then I did like each stanza kind of went back and forth, and it was like a wave. And I made my paper look like a wave. And my instructor thought it was very nice. So I would encourage you to be creative. You know, if you can find a way to make your verses organize a certain way, do it. Do whatever you think will make your poem look the best that it possibly can. Antithesis, antithesis, or antithesis is taking a certain theme and building a poem whose purpose is in direct opposition. So it's kind of like you're trolling your audience. I call it antithesis. Some people say antithesis because it makes sense to say antithesis. Antithesis is like the Greek original way to say it. But you're basically building a poem whose purpose is actually the opposite of what a common theme is. So it'd be like your poem being about heroes and legacy, and then it'd be about Achilles and his heel who's hit with one arrow and he's dead. So, I mean, some poetry, that's the goal, is to kind of take tropes and put them on their head and show how silly they might be. On page 663, we kind of see the Greek meaning of antithesis, and we kind of see that played out here towards the bottom. So you look at the bottom, page 663, you see there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. Meaning that like 1,000 people are hitting the branches when one just needs to get to the root of the problem. So you can kind of see how the example is in direct opposition of what should be happening in the poem. You can kind of see those 3 examples there. So, and they ask you to make up your own imitations. Again, antithesis, cumulative, counterpoint, parallelism, repetition, these are all stylistic options. You don't have to have all of them in your poem. It would be insane to put every term of poetry into a poem. It just wouldn't work. the nice thing is you get to kind of pick and choose, okay, which of these elements am I going to use? Which do I see in the poems or songs I'm talking about? And which am I going to imitate? So that's kind of the cool thing. You get to pick and choose what you want to talk about in the poems that you're analyzing or in the ones that you create. Okay? Metaphysical means talking about passionate elements, analyzing and rationalizing them. It's the opposite of concrete poetry. Metaphysical means it's not really there, but it kind of is. It's sort of like emotions. We know happiness and sadness exist. They're just not quite tangible. And they come in different forms for everyone. So everyone's definition of sadness is different. Everyone's definition of happiness is different. It's very hard to pin down an emotion and make it universal. All right? So that's basically the chapter on pattern. And they give us some really cool examples. Gary Soto's Oranges is kind of cool. It's like talking about a bilingual poem, which is an option. If any of you are bilingual, you can do some bilingual poetry. I've had a student do it, and it was really cool. They had the verses, one was in one language, one was in another, and they talked about repetition and how it was different when you had it in different languages. Top-notch paper. And then you can also look at Robert Frost's Fire and Ice on page 673. That's a good poem. It's really short, but really good. And then we get into the chapter on image. And I put chapter image and metaphor together because you will notice in chapter 14, there are no terms. Just image. That's it. And we all know what an image is, right? I will say this first bullet point here on page 698 to check out the glossy pages in your book of the poem image combos. I really like this book for having it. What happened here is that these were poems that were chosen and pieces of artwork that were chosen separately to put beside the poem. So these poems and images aren't necessarily related, but they kind of are. So it's really cool. It's like taking two things that shouldn't be the same and putting them together, and I really like that. So you will actually have an assignment that talks about using these glossy pages, and you'll get to pick and choose which ones you like and dislike the most. All right? And that's pretty much chapter 14. It's all about using imagery, which it's sad that I don't talk much about chapter 14 because it's such a big part of poetry. You want your reader to imagine and have an image in mind when they encounter poetry. You want them to see something when they engage in poetry. You want the words to paint a picture to them. And there's so many examples in this chapter that it would take me hours to read through all of them. I would go to page 700 though. 700 and 701. Look at California Hills in August by Dana Gioia and John Keats' To Autumn. Like, not only because these two poems are written very, very far apart, like we're talking almost over 100 years apart, but look at their use of seasonal. I mean, we're talking August into autumn. So these two poems are talking about very similar points in time. I want you to read these two poems and see how similar they are for being so far apart in when they were written. And I think that's really cool. And also see the imagery that they create. The way that they talk about how things are shaped, how fruit looks, how trees look, how leaves look, how things feel. We typically, when we think of the senses, we always, I say always, but people tend to focus on sight, on sound, and on touch, which is good. You need those three sentences. But we forget taste and smell. So, don't be afraid to describe how things taste, how they smell, and incorporate that and put that along with your other senses that you're talking about. Okay? So I would look at those two poems because I think it's fascinating that they have so much time in between them, but yet are so very similar. All right. And then our chapter on metaphor. We've talked about metaphor quite a bit in the last unit. This chapter starts on page 714. So they basically go over metaphors again and similes. So I think everyone got these questions right on the fiction exam. Metaphors are comparing two things without like or as. Similes is doing the same thing with like or as. So they kind of give us a refresher on metaphor and simile. They advise us on page 716 to beware of cliches. Cliches we talked about are overused puns, overused metaphors. Like the window of opportunity or the tip of the iceberg. Those have been said 100 times over, right? So they encourage us to come up with more original metaphors and ways of comparing two things rather than something that if you say it to yourself and you're like, oh, I've heard that before, it might be cliche. You might be a cliche writer. They also talk about in this chapter extended and controlling metaphor. We've talked about extended metaphor in last week's video and how that it is a metaphor repeated throughout the poem. A controlling metaphor, it's kind of like lucid dreaming. In lucid dreams are where you are dreaming but you know you're dreaming so you can control it. That's what a controlling metaphor is. It's when the extended metaphor becomes the central theme or driving factor of the poem. So the metaphor is not only a comparison now, it is the comparison. It's like the central symbol. It's like the thing the poem is about. And it doesn't happen often, but there are quite a few poems where the metaphor does become a controlling factor. And our example of that comes onto page 719 with Mary Swenson's question, where it starts out talking about how her body represents something, and by the end of it, that whole question of what her body represents becomes the driving factor of the rest of her character. Like, where will her character go? What will her character do? It all depends on this metaphor. So that's when a controlling metaphor comes in. And metaphors, again, they're stylistic choices. You don't have to have a bunch in your poems. But if you do have these options. You can make them extended or controlling if, you do so desire. Figurative language in poetry is the comparison to something that's not real. So if someone says that they are figuratively speaking, that means that they're not really saying that. They're just kind of, if you go, I'm as hungry, I could eat a whole horse, figuratively speaking. You wouldn't really eat a whole horse, but you're just saying that you're so hungry, it sounds like you could, right? And a lot of poetry will have figurative language in it to try to drive home and make a point. And they talk about that on page 722. And this kind of connects to symbolism as well. Something that's not real but maybe has a different meaning that the items in your poem can connect to. That would be figurative language. All right. Sonnets and conceits. Anytime someone thinks of a poem or a type of poem, I think one of the most common terms that comes up are sonnets. How many of you wrote sonnets in high school? I remember writing a few. Not too many, but a few. Sonnets are 14-line poems, specifically. That is it. They are 14 lines long. Shakespeare was well known for his sonnets. I mean, well known. Shakespeare liked to write in sonnets. And on page 728, you will see Sonnet 73 by William Shakespeare. That means there were 72 other sonnets. And there's more than 73. That's just Sonnet 73 right there. But you'll notice it's 14 lines long. The rhyme pattern of it, if we look on page 729, we look at the last word of each of these lines. We have behold, A, hang, B, cold, A, sang, B. So we have A, B, A, B. Day, C, west, D, away, C, rest, D. So we have A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, fire, E, lie, F, expire, E, buy. Oh gosh, I've lost track of letters. But you see we got A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then G, G. And notice, we've also got, Shakespeare also is using some half rhyme and slant rhymes, because you've got like lie and buy. Lie and buy don't technically rhyme, but they're slant rhymes, so they'll work. Right? So that's a sonnet. They can be in different patterns, they can be different formats, they just have to be 14 lines long. It's kind of like the opposite of a haiku. A haiku has to be 3 lines long and have a specific 5-7-5 syllable pattern. Sonnets just have to have 14 lines, and the syllables and rhyming can be whatever you like. Alright? And then finally we have conceits, which are elaborately developed and set up several analogies or comparisons or stories within the poem. Conceits are very detailed in structure, and I would argue they're not used too often. They're a little bit more rare than that of a sonnet. All right, a lot of conceits are about love or about things that are comparing, like compare thee to a rose or compare thee to this and blah blah and so forth. They're just specifically what the poem is about, where a sonnet is how long is it. Alright? So yeah, pattern, image, and metaphor. Lots of things. You will notice that the next chapter is going to be about symbolism, which we're going to touch on next week in week 8. But for now, that is all of our poetry terminology. Exciting stuff, right? So, as you're working on your outlines for paper 2, please feel free to give me any questions if you have them. I'm excited so far with your thesis statements from week 6. Let me know if you have any questions, and otherwise, I look forward to seeing your discussion forums for week 7 and week 6, and I am excited to talk to you all again about poetry soon. Bye!